to talk about a new typology or a new campus typology and how suburban technology tenants are moving to the city. Seattle's a fairly unique place. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I love it. It's nestled between the mountains and the Sound, and it has unparalleled beauty, a significant tech population, as well as enough caffeine from Starbucks to power a jet engine. It's a 24-hour city that's become the second fastest growing tech hub in the country. Companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and dozens of others have headquarters or significant sized offices in our market, as well as companies like Nordstrom's, Starbucks, and Boeing are all changing the way we even perceive what a tech company is. We also have two fairly unique case studies of technology campuses in the Northwest. One in Microsoft and the other in Amazon.com. Microsoft's a very, we'll call it traditional technology campus, in that it's in the suburbs, about 20 minutes outside of Seattle, where Amazon is a fairly new and unique technology campus that is centered around the South Lake Union neighborhood of Seattle. But the question is how did two companies of this size get to the position they're in such dramatically different ways? Excuse me. So Microsoft was founded in about 1975, and it was actually founded in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And shortly after that, it moved back to its roots, where its founders' roots are up in Seattle, just outside of Seattle. And in 1986, Microsoft went public, and they started growing significantly. And they grew their campus to over 9 million square feet and approximately 30,000 employees. You can see that the outlined red area is their current campus. The area to the right was their original campus's little X buildings you see there. Those were some of their original buildings, and they recently almost doubled the size of the campus in the last 10 years. Amazon took a very different approach. In 1994, Jeff Bezos crossed the country on a road trip after quitting his job on Wall Street. And when he ended up in Bellevue, he started a small company and started occupying space throughout the Seattle marketplace. In 1997, just as the dot-com bubble was about to burst, Amazon went public. But surprisingly, they came out of the other side of the bust in solid ground, and they started consuming significant market share. And by 2013, they'd occupied 14 mid-rise and high-rise buildings throughout the Seattle market. So how did these companies take such different paths? We'll go back to 1968. This is about the beginning of the information age, or what we consider the information age. This is Paul Allen and Bill Gates. Bill Gates, I think, was about 13 years old in this image. And they're in the basement of their Lakeside High School. This is a suburban high school just in the outskirts of Seattle. And what's interesting is not many high schools at this time had computers. Not many companies at this time had computers. But the high schools that did have computers were often located in wealthy suburban neighborhoods. And so it wasn't too surprising that whenever you started to see startups come out in the technology world, they were coming out of the garages of these wealthy suburban neighborhoods. And when they outgrew those garages, they moved into suburban office parks. And those office parks developed into suburban office campuses. Let's fast forward to the mid-90s. This is about the time that Amazon got its start. No longer were students learning to code in their basement. They were learning at universities across the country in major cities everywhere. And this had a significant impact on the next generation of startups. When students were graduating and starting companies of their own, they weren't starting them in suburban garages. They were starting them on the edges of the CBD, in loft spaces and places where you could find very affordable rents, but yet still be close enough to the universities and other startups so that you could take talent when you needed it, and you could grow. So it's not too surprising that the majority of these campuses that started up in the urban areas were on the edge of the CBD. These buildings that are highlighted here, those are Amazon's buildings currently. The buildings in the foreground, those are the early buildings that they had developed. And you'll see that as you get closer to the CBD, the buildings get taller, and this is a more recent development over the last 5 to 6 years that's seen them taking more and more a position in high-rise buildings. What I find really interesting is that currently they're planning, or 2 of the buildings are actually under construction, but they're planning 4 new high-rise buildings that were built just for them. This is about 20,000 employees. That's nearly doubling the size of their staff in Seattle in 4 buildings. Oops, excuse me, I'll go back. So how does this happen? How did this happen in 20 years? Well, today, Seattle's experiencing about 17% annual tech growth, which is pretty significant for a town of only 700,000 people. And this new generation of tech talent isn't going to be recruited with the same tools they used in the previous generation. A ping pong table and free snacks are just not going to cut it anymore. This new generation, what we've been referring to as the millennial generation, is much more interested in a work-life balance. And this often means they're not interested in a commute 30 to 40 minutes each way to work to the suburbs. And this next generation, the millennial generation, they want to live in the city. Peter Katz, an urban theorist, I think put it best when he said, millennials have very little interest in returning to the cul-de-sac of their teenage years. And this is making a lot of big tech companies rethink their approach. I'm sure you've heard about some of this, where companies like Apple and Facebook and Google and Microsoft, they've all started developing private bus systems, taking their employees from the city centers out to their suburban campuses. And this has had some degree of success in retaining employees, but it's still not quite working. And what we're finding now is they're moving more and more to having branch offices in the city centers themselves. Well, this is causing cities like LA, New York, San Francisco, Seattle to provide significant tax incentives for these companies to keep moving those employees to the city center. Tony Hsieh of Zappos.com, which is actually owned by Amazon now, he put it best when he said, the idea went from let's build a campus to let's build a city. And that's a pretty significant step for an industry that has significantly and still maintains a significant campus out of the city centers. So with real estate prices going up at rates that we haven't seen in years, there's not a lot of room to grow in the cities except for up. So for the rest of this presentation, I'd like to talk about some of the subtle but necessary changes we're seeing in the high-rise industry that is accommodating this new tech tenant. Probably the biggest one that we're seeing is density. I'm gonna refer to the rest of as a traditional tenant as a fire tenant. That's a financial, insurance, or real estate tenant. That's a little bit more traditional in at least our marketplace, who's been occupying high-rise buildings over the last 50 years. So a fire tenant occupies space at about 1 person for every 200 square feet or so, where a tech tenant is increasing the density to about 1 person for 135 square feet. Now, obviously this isn't the same around the world, but this is in our marketplace. And that can create some significant increases in infrastructure, especially when you look at it as, say, a 20,000 square foot floor plate. You're increasing the population of that floor plate by nearly 50%. So infrastructure is a big issue. One of the key pieces of infrastructure is electricity. Plug loads and cooling loads are becoming significant. A traditional tech engineer will often use somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 monitors, 3 CPUs, a laptop, and several miscellaneous personal electronics in their own space. And yes, electronics are becoming much more efficient, but when you're increasing them by this amount, it makes a significant increase to both the plug and the cooling loads. So what we're finding is we're increasing our plug loads expectations from 2.5 watts per square foot to 5 watts per square foot. And so far, that's been able to keep pace. And we're hoping that as electronics increase in efficiency, that number will be able to go back down. Another area we have a concern for, is in the live loads. A traditional fire tenant would have a law library or a high-density file storage or something along those lines that they could locate in a windowless room next to the core. And you could just isolate that area that needed to be increased. The structure would need to be increased to accommodate. But with tech tenants, they're constantly shifting and constantly moving, growing and shrinking in size. And with them comes server farms. Most of these servers can't be connected to the outside world. They don't like the core to be more than 10 feet long. They're very concerned about anybody ever getting access to these while they're beta testing some of their products. So we find that these server farms move all around the building, up and down. We don't know where they're gonna end up next. And sometimes they move every 3 to 4 months. And so to increase the flexibility that it could have, we've increased the live load capacity and the expectations at 80 pounds per square foot. Toilets. I didn't expect to fly halfway around the world to talk about toilets, but here we are. It's interesting. Most codes allow or expect about 50% of the employees to be male and 50% to be female. That's not the case in the tech industry. It's not anywhere close. What we're seeing, and some surveys have pointed out, it's less than 12.5% of computer engineers are female. This causes a pretty big issue when it comes to the restrooms. When you've got over 80% of the occupants all trying to get to the restroom right before and after lunch. So what we're doing is significantly increasing the amount of restrooms we're providing in the men's room. Now this may seem trivial, but this is not something you can retrofit easily. So this needs to be accommodated early on in the design process. Elevators. This is a problem that most tech groups just geek out over. They love the idea that they can quantify exactly what it means to have a faster or slower elevator. Let's say, for an example, you've got a tower of 5,000 people, and it takes an extra minute to go from the ground floor to their desk every day, up and down, every time they go up and down. That averages out to about averages out to about 20,000 man hours a year lost going from your desk to the lobby, and vice versa. So we've tried to do our best to accommodate the fastest and most efficient elevator system as possible. A traditional fire tenant would have one cab for every 50,000 square feet. In tech tenants, we're increasing that by about 20% and making sure that all new elevators and some retrofitted elevators are destination dispatch systems. This significantly increases the efficiency of an elevator. So obviously, there's a lot of cost to this infrastructure. So what does that mean? Well, what we're finding is that if you can accommodate all of these necessary infrastructure upgrades for a technology tenant, they're willing to pay for it. They're willing to pay more for it. If you're missing some, you can almost dial that back the rent accordingly. We've been surprised at how many leases have fallen through because there weren't enough restrooms for the men, or there weren't efficient elevator systems. And that was a fundamental flaw that they couldn't get through. So in addition to density, another aspect of the high-rise tower that we're seeing change related to tech tenants is the program. Not necessarily the entire program, there's still office space throughout, but mainly around the lobby and the ground floor. Gone are the days of this beautiful, luxurious lobbies with beautiful pieces of furniture that nobody ever sits in. Those are getting replaced with retail. There's a much higher value for most technology tenant buildings. In a suburban setting, a lot of these companies like Facebook, and you may have even heard of Google's gourmet kitchens, well, they provide kitchens, they provide gym facilities, they provide medical resources at times. All of that is to keep their employees in the office more and not commuting back and forth. And in the suburbs, that can be a significant amount of time. In the urban setting, that's a big advantage for urban campuses, is that you have those amenities built into the city. You don't need to build them for your employees. So we're finding that retail at the ground floor is a significant plus, especially when it caters to that tech group, the restaurants, bars, and coffee shops, things of that nature that are really focused on that generation of employees are a significant uptick for good buildings. We're also noticing on the ground floor is security is significantly increased. It used to be with these grand lobbies, you may have a concierge or someone at the front desk, but now what we're seeing is very significant security presence. Sometimes that's the entire purpose of the ground floor lobby, is simply to get through security. And intellectual property theft is the main culprit. A lot of people talk about how a network gets hacked here, or that network got hacked, and this amount of data got lost. Well, that is true, especially about user data. But the technology that they're worried about losing is their own personal software that they're developing. And the number one way they lose that is it walks right out the front door. Some of the companies are even implementing systems where you're scanned on the way in and on the way out for portable hard drives. And this obviously takes a significant amount of space. So we're seeing the ground floor lobby almost turn into a security checkpoint, similar to an airport. But that's not to say the ground floor lobby is going away. It's actually just moving up to the second floor. Typically, this is a floor that's not that high of value when it comes to lease rates. So what we're seeing is what we're calling a great room. And that room has got a concierge desk, informal meeting spaces, formal meeting spaces, sometimes even major conference centers. And what this allows is an already mobile workforce to be even more flexible on where and when they work. It also allows for a multi-tenanted building to have amenities that maybe a smaller tenant couldn't justify in their space, but can use throughout the year. Another aspect of the lobby is most of the companies, even though these great rooms and the security and the retail on the lower floors is very communal, they still want to have that presence of, this is our space, and when you walk into it, you want to know our brand, you want to see how great our space is. And so what we're finding is a lot of these tenants, they want to move that up to the floor that they're occupying, or floors they're occupying. Having multi-floor atriums as a lobby is becoming a very common design strategy to kind of have that brand identity when you walk right off the elevators. Sustainability, I'm not going to get into this a lot today because we've got a full week booked of that, and I think there's going to be some really great stuff we're going to hear. But I just want to talk a little bit about technology firms have been on the cutting edge of technology when it comes to sustainability as well. Google has done things like the red materials list that you may have heard about, and just overall just trying to increase the quality of air and the indoor environment. But they're also looking for new technological ways to accommodate sustainability. So this is something I think we're on the verge of seeing a lot more of, but I won't dive too deep today. So in conclusion, the things that I'd like you to try and remember, if you remember anything from this talk, is that density and program are shifting. Not significantly, not dramatically, but subtly. And these things are going to be continuing to evolve over the coming generations of high-rise focused tech tenants. And it's going to be a significant challenge for us to stay ahead of the game. I mean, many of the people in the room here are working on these problems day in and day out, but I'm sure that we'll be up for that challenge. So thank you.